From the outside, everything looked perfect. A lavish estate with marble floors that shone like mirrors, a family dynasty steeped in old money, and a beautiful wife carrying the promise of a new heir. But behind the gilded doors, a storm was brewing, one that would tear apart lives, reputations, and fortunes. Late one night, as his pregnant wife slept, a man quietly changed the locks to secure everything for himself. Little did he know by sunrise her powerful father's legal team would move faster than lightning to change the entire deed. What followed was a showdown that shook their world forever. Margaret Maggie Kensington was the golden girl of the Kensington lineage, an American dynasty tracing their roots back to 19th century railroad magnates. Her father, James Kensington III, was a multi-millionaire real estate mogul, whose portfolio spanned Manhattan skyscrapers, Los Angeles mansions, and sprawling farmland in the Midwest. Everywhere Maggie went, paparazzi seemed eager to catch the next American royal in a glamorous setting. Yet for all the opulence, Maggie's true desire was simply to find love and start a family on her own terms. She believed she had found her dream man in Anthony Tony Giordano. Handsome, confident, and seemingly brimming with ambition, Tony wooed Maggie at a charity gala organized by the Kensington Foundation. That night, Tony was seated at the same table as Maggie purely by chance, or so she believed at the time. He was working in private equity, or so he claimed, though no one knew the exact nature of his businesses. Maggie, charmed by his intense gaze and quick wit, felt a magnetic attraction she couldn't deny. Almost overnight, their relationship ascended to a whirlwind romance. Tony was the consummate gentleman, roses in the morning, heartfelt poems scribbled on napkins during dinner, long drives up the coast. Meanwhile, Maggie's father watched warily. He recognized Tony's name from idle conversation among New York's elite circles, though not always for the best reasons. James Kensington prided himself on being well-informed. He had a network of private investigators and attorneys who kept him apprised of every suitor who entered Maggie's orbit. Yet in his desire to see his daughter happy, he initially held back from interfering. Maggie and Tony's wedding was a dazzling affair at the family's estate on Long Island. 300 guests, a gown from Vera Wang, and a hush of anticipation when Maggie walked down the aisle. Tony wore a grin that seemed equal parts excitement and triumph as he gazed upon his bride. Cameras flashed endlessly, capturing the moment society watchers had deemed the next big match. In the months following the wedding, Maggie glowed with contentment. She announced her pregnancy shortly after their honeymoon. To James Kensington, this new grandchild meant the continuation of the family line and heir to his sprawling empire. Maggie was thrilled. Tony was exuberant about the prospect of fatherhood. He boasted that their child would have the world at their fingertips. But cracks began to form in the facade. Tony's financial dealings were murky at best. He frequently canceled meetings or gave vague answers about his business trips. Curious social acquaintances who asked how Tony's company was structured never got a straight answer. Maggie's father's instincts flared. Still, Maggie remained convinced that Tony was simply a busy, successful man, determined to give her and their unborn child the best life possible. Then, one ordinary Sunday, after Maggie mentioned a desire to refurbish an old wing of the mansion they occupied, one that her father had gifted them upon marriage, Tony's expression turned oddly guarded. A shift in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. Something was off, though Maggie couldn't quite place it. It was a small sign of the tempest to come. Over the next few weeks, the veneer of their blissful union began to peel away. Tony's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He took late-night phone calls, stepping outside in the cold, pacing the property's expansive grounds, whispering in hushed tones. He frequently traveled to meet international investors, but left Maggie in the dark about the real nature of these meetings. Each time he returned, Maggie tried to press him for details, but Tony had perfected the art of deflection. Money seemed to be flowing in and out of mysterious accounts. Maggie overheard staff gossip about new construction projects being halted, rumored lawsuits, and even a rumored connection to a questionable financing group. Whispers suggested Tony had borrowed large sums against property he didn't fully own. Alarm bells rang in Maggie's mind. She had seen too many socialites fall prey to gold diggers who latched onto wealthy families. She had always believed Tony was different. After all, he had been so gentle, so attentive. Yet each day more evidence stacked up against him. James Kensington quietly initiated a background check on Tony. Through his network, he found out that Tony's private equity background was murkier than expected. There was no official listing of him leading any recognized firm, nor were there substantial assets in his name, except curiously the Long Island mansion that belonged to Maggie before their marriage. Tony, however, had placed it in both their names shortly after the wedding, something James hadn't fully caught on to at the time. It was a cunning move that suggested Tony had planned meticulously. Maggie began to question Tony's affection. Her once romantic husband started to exhibit a temper she had never seen before, becoming controlling about household decisions. He demanded she keep track of every expense and criticized her for frivolous spending, even if it was for new baby clothes or nursery items. When Maggie was too emotionally drained to argue, he would placate her with sweet words about how he wanted to be the sole provider. At night, Maggie would curl up in bed, feeling the baby kick inside her, trying to stifle her tears. She felt an ominous sense of betrayal creeping into her life, like a shadow growing bolder by the day. As her due date approached, she clung to the hope that Tony was merely under stress, that fatherhood was causing him panic, that he feared not living up to the Kensington name. Despite her father's stern warnings, Maggie tried to salvage her marriage by arranging counseling sessions. Tony scoffed. "I don't need a shrink telling me how to live my life," he barked. Maggie's heart sank. Tension ratcheted higher, and the staff on the estate could sense the rift widening. One by one, they tiptoed around the mansion, afraid of encountering Tony's outbursts. Behind the scenes, James Kensington was not idle. He hired attorneys and accountants to wade through the labyrinth of Tony's financial transactions. To James, time was of the essence. Maggie was due to give birth in a few months, and he wanted to safeguard both his daughter and future grandchild. Secretly, James began drafting a plan that would protect his daughter's inheritance. But Tony, sharper than most gave him credit for, was forging his own plan, a ruthless one that would come to a head in a single night. As the season turned crisp and autumn leaves drifted across the mansion's manicured gardens, Maggie noticed small but telling changes. A gold-framed wedding photograph disappeared from the mantel, replaced by Tony's sleek sports car model. Precious heirloom vases that once adorned the foyer were gone, sold off in a private sale Tony had arranged. He brushed off Maggie's concerns, insisting it was a redecoration effort. But she knew better. Her priceless family pieces were vanishing without her consent. Meanwhile, James Kensington's top investigator uncovered staggering debts linked to Tony. Loans from offshore entities, gambling markers from high-stakes private clubs, and potential legal disputes with old associates. The only bright side, none of these had yet impacted the Kensington fortune directly. But it was only a matter of time. Alarmed, James confronted Maggie with the evidence. She sat in her father's study, tears brimming, struggling to comprehend how the man she had loved so wholeheartedly could be so deceitful. James proposed a solution. He offered to buy out Tony's share of the mansion to extricate him from the property. Then Maggie could move away. She could choose from any number of Kensington holdings and never see Tony again. But for reasons that were part love, part fear, Maggie hesitated. She still held a sliver of belief that Tony was redeemable, that the pressure of fatherhood and the Kensington name had driven him to rash decisions. Moreover, she was terrified. She had married for love, and the idea of her child growing up with divorced parents weighed heavily on her. Tony seemed to sense Maggie's dual state of vulnerability and lingering devotion. He ramped up romantic gestures in public while quietly consolidating control of the mansion behind the scenes. He had a new lawyer in tow, a slick talker named Trevor Holcomb, who specialized in property negotiations. The local gossip mill went wild. Something big was on the horizon, but no one could pinpoint exactly what Tony was planning. Unbeknownst to everyone, Tony had begun forging Maggie's signature on a series of documents related to the mansion. He intended to refinance it under his sole control, using the equity to bail out some of his more dangerous creditors. It was a drastic, reckless move, yet Tony was determined. He believed that as long as he could keep Maggie in the dark, he would manage to stay ahead of the avalanche. One night after a particularly heated argument about finances, Tony observed Maggie storm upstairs to bed exhausted. Through the closed door, he could hear her sobs. And then in the silence that followed, he knew she had drifted off. Tony crept through the mansion, systematically checking windows and doors. He was planning something for which he needed absolute secrecy. In the back of his mind, Tony also knew the Kensington patriarch was already plotting against him. Outside, under the glow of the porch light, Tony took out a keyring. He tested each lock quietly, ensuring no squeak of the handle would disturb Maggie's sleep. The plan swirled in his mind like a dark cloud. Change the locks, claim ownership and wrest control from his unsuspecting wife before her father could intervene. That was the night the old locks were replaced with new ones. And in a single stroke of near-sinister cunning, Tony's intentions became terrifyingly clear. Under the hush of midnight, Tony executed his plan with a methodical precision that spoke volumes of his desperation. In the space of 2 hours, he quietly removed the original locks from each door of the mansion. The only sounds were the faint clinking of metal and the subdued buzz of crickets in the surrounding gardens. He installed new locks using a small flashlight and pre-purchased hardware, carefully placing the old locks in a padded box to avoid rattling. As he worked, Tony recalled the countless arguments with Maggie, her accusing him of deception, him insisting he was just trying to protect their family. He thought of James Kensington's looming presence, an alpha wolf circling the perimeter ready to pounce the moment he smelled blood. Tony wasn't blind to James's power. He knew the old man had money, influence, and an army of lawyers on retainer, including the renowned David Boys, a name whispered in legal circles as someone you never wanted to face unprepared. And Tony was far from prepared in a conventional sense. His finances were in tatters. But he had grit, a cunning streak that he believed could outmaneuver the larger predator. In the master bedroom, Maggie slept fitfully, cradling her pregnant belly. She dreamed of the child she would soon bring into this world, wanting only peace and security for them. Little did she know, with every twist of Tony's screwdriver, that security was being undone. By 2 a.m., Tony finished the final door. He locked the house from the inside and sat on the sofa, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The locks were changed. The mansion was in his mind, his domain now. If Maggie's father wanted to intrude, Tony would have legal standing to deny him entry. He grinned, feeling triumphant in his cunning. In a last chilling act of ownership, he walked to the front gate and locked it too, pocketing the new key as if it were a precious gem. Yet Tony underestimated two things. First, James Kensington's readiness to defend his daughter at all costs. And second, Maggie's own awakening sense of betrayal that would soon transform her from a naive romantic to a mother protecting her unborn child. Because on that very same night, James's investigators delivered a crucial finding directly to his home office. It was proof of forgery, Tony's attempt to refinance the mansion without Maggie's consent. Accompanying that proof was the revelation of a massive debt Tony owed to a syndicate rumored to have ties to organized crime. James, incensed and protective, made a midnight call to his legal team, who sprang into action like a well-oiled machine. And so, while Tony was busy changing the locks, James Kensington and his lawyers were busy changing something far more consequential, the deed to the mansion itself. Within hours before dawn even brushed the horizon, the legal gears were grinding. By the time morning light broke, Tony would wake up to a reality far more precarious than he ever anticipated. Sunrise brought an uneasy stillness. Maggie awoke feeling oddly trapped, realizing her bedroom door was locked from the outside. Panic surged. She fiddled with the knob, eventually managing to unlock it, but the act set her heart racing. She descended the grand staircase, her bare feet silent on the polished wood, searching for Tony. She found him in the living room, looking haggard, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The tension was palpable. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Pregnancy hormones amplifying her anxiety. Tony feigned innocence, but the guilt weighed heavily on his features. He offered weak excuses. Talk of protecting the family estate, ensuring no one intruded, and claiming he had to reinforce security. But Maggie saw through the facade. She ran her hand over her swollen belly, fear sinking in like a cold stone. In that moment, she recognized a fundamental shift. The man she had loved was a stranger now. While they argued, Maggie's phone pinged with an urgent text from her father. A single line read, "Get out of the house. Come to my office immediately." Maggie, shaken, rushed to gather her belongings. She had to leave before Tony could object. But to her shock, Tony stood firm in the doorway. "You're not going anywhere," he said, arms folded. The threat in his tone froze Maggie in place. For a brief second, she feared for her physical safety. Tony had never laid a hand on her before, but the intensity in his eyes now was unnerving. Just then, the piercing ring of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Tony turned toward the entrance, confusion flickering across his face. Maggie seized the moment and darted toward the foyer. She flung the door open to find a man in a crisp suit holding a briefcase, an attorney from her father's legal team. Behind him stood two uniformed security officials, each with a stern expression. The attorney introduced himself as Charles Beaumont from the law firm that James Kensington had recently enlisted. Politely, but with underlying steel, he handed Tony a thick packet of papers stating, "By order of the Suffolk County Court, you are hereby served." Tony snatched the documents, flipping through the pages in growing disbelief. Maggie couldn't comprehend everything in that moment. All she heard were key phrases: fraudulent refinancing, deed transfer, and temporary restraining order. Her eyes darted to Tony, whose face darkened with rage. Beaumont continued, "The property has been transferred back into a trust under Maggie's name. You have no legal claim to the mansion as of 4 a.m. this morning." Tony erupted, hurling accusations and expletives. He insisted he was being framed, that it was all a giant misunderstanding. But the attorney remained unflappable. He declared that Tony was to vacate the premises immediately. The security guards stepped forward, their presence a clear warning. Maggie clutched her stomach, her baby kicking in alarm as if sensing her distress. Tony glared at her, eyes brimming with venom and desperation. In the space of a single dawn, Tony's perfect plan had imploded, and Maggie had never felt so conflicted, fearful, yet oddly relieved to see the wheels of her father's powerful influence turning in her favor. Tony was forced to leave the mansion under the watchful eyes of the guards. He packed a single suitcase, stuffing in clothes, a few personal effects, and most importantly, the documents he believed would save him. Fury and humiliation etched into his features as he marched out, cursing under his breath. He couldn't believe he had been outmaneuvered so swiftly. He imagined James Kensington gloating in some high-rise office, reveling in this victory. For Tony, the eviction wasn't just a loss of property. It was a public humiliation that threatened to unravel everything he'd built, or at least claimed to have built. Meanwhile, Maggie slumped onto a velvet chair in the living room, tears welling. The security team discreetly waited outside, giving her space. Charles Beaumont spoke softly, assuring her that she was now protected by a restraining order, preventing Tony from stepping foot on the property or contacting her without legal counsel present. Maggie nodded, numb. Her life had flipped upside down in the space of a single morning. James Kensington arrived within the hour, striding in with his usual calm yet commanding presence. He embraced Maggie, who melted into his arms, relief and sadness mingling. There, in the gilded confines of her home, the father-daughter duo finally confronted the aftermath of Tony's betrayal. "He can't just waltz back in," James said quietly. "He's locked out permanently if you want him to be." Maggie trembled at the finality of those words. Despite everything, she grieved for the love she had lost. She had not married Tony to end up in a legal war. She had envisioned a family, the joyous arrival of their child, a future filled with birthdays and anniversaries. Now she found herself at the epicenter of a scandal that would no doubt grace the pages of every gossip column. Still, Maggie steeled herself. She had to think about her baby's welfare above all. With her father's reassurance, she agreed to formalize divorce proceedings. Tony's actions had crossed a line from which there was no return. Maggie knew she needed to protect not just her inheritance, but her emotional well-being and her child's future. James explained how he had tapped David Boyes, a high-profile attorney with a record of tackling complex litigations, to serve in an advisory capacity. Boyes' team, along with Charles Beaumont, had worked through the night to secure the mansion deed. They found an obscure clause in the prenuptial agreement which specified that all Kensington gifts to Maggie remained solely under her name unless she signed a transfer of intent form. This was the form Tony had tried to forge. With clear evidence of forgery, the courts granted an immediate injunction rolling back all Tony's claims. As Maggie's pulse steadied, she realized her father's move was both protective and punitive. The message was clear. No one defrauds a Kensington without facing consequences. She also understood Tony wouldn't slink away quietly. He was cornered and desperate, two traits that make for dangerous retaliation. Tears finally subsiding, Maggie glanced around the mansion with a mix of relief and sorrow, bracing herself for the battles ahead. Tony stormed into a modest hotel near the Long Island docks, flanked by his personal lawyer, Trevor Holcomb. The crisp legal papers from James Kensington's team sat on a small desk, their importance stark against the dingy lamp's yellow glow. Holcomb sifted through them, muttering legal jargon Tony barely grasped. Each phrase felt like a nail in his coffin. Fraudulent conveyance, falsification of signatures, attempted misrepresentation. Tony's rage simmered, but fear also crept in. If convicted of these charges, he could lose more than property. He could lose his freedom. Still, Tony was not one to surrender easily. "We need a counterattack," he barked at Holcomb. "I won't be run out like a criminal. This is my house, my wife, my child." Holcomb lifted an eyebrow. He knew the complexities. The deck was stacked in the Kensingtons' favor. Money influence and airtight legal strategies. "We could argue duress," Holcomb offered, "or claim you acted under some confusion with the property titles. But the forgery evidence is strong. We need a different angle." Tony considered a dark idea taking shape. He had plenty of secrets that might tarnish the Kensington brand if made public. Rumors of unscrupulous real estate deals, hush-hush payoffs to local officials. He had gleaned tidbits over dinner conversations, drunken confessions from certain Kensington executives who wanted to impress him. Perhaps he could threaten to go public with these allegations, real or exaggerated, hoping to force a settlement. Holcomb was hesitant. Going after James Kensington's reputation is risky. He's a powerful man. If we fail, it'll backfire. But Tony was resolute. "I'd rather go down swinging than roll over." That night, Tony made a series of phone calls. He reached out to tabloid journalists, feeding them rumors about the Kensington empire. He hinted at shady backroom deals, illegal land grabs, and environmental violations. With the divorce and property dispute making headlines, Tony hoped the scandal-hungry media would jump on any new angle. His ploy was straightforward: create as much negative press for James and Maggie as possible, forcing them to negotiate out of embarrassment. And it worked, at least initially. A tabloid website ran a sensational headline: "Kensington fortune built on lies, estranged husband of heiress speaks out." The story circulated on social media, turning the mansion lockout saga into a national curiosity. But to Tony's chagrin, James Kensington didn't appear rattled. In fact, James's PR team swiftly debunked every claim, even threatening legal action for defamation. Some mainstream outlets even ridiculed Tony, describing his allegations as unverified ramblings of a desperate man. Tony was livid. Desperation gnawed at him. He spent hours pacing his hotel room, phone in hand, scanning the latest developments. He also received ominous messages from certain creditors, those rumored to have ties to organized crime. They had learned about the fiasco and demanded repayment immediately. Tony was cornered from all angles. Yet even as the walls closed in, Tony clung to a twisted sense of pride. He resolved that if he couldn't have Maggie or the mansion, he would extract a cost from the Kensingtons in some way, shape, or form. In that moment, he vowed to mount one final stand: consequences be damned. For Maggie, life became a blur of legal consultations, doctor's appointments, and emotional stress. The tabloids feasted on the drama, each publication spinning its own sensational version of events. "Pregnant heiress locked in legal showdown," screamed one headline. Paparazzi staked out the gates of the mansion, hoping for a glimpse of Maggie in tears or an angry confrontation with Tony. Amid the chaos, Maggie's central concern was the baby. Each visit to her obstetrician reminded her that stress could adversely affect her pregnancy. She tried to shield herself from the constant media noise, retreating to a smaller townhouse that James kept in the city, an address far from prying eyes. The mansion remained heavily guarded. Maggie wanted no association with that place until the legal matters were settled. James insisted on handling the press, allowing Maggie to focus on her health. He released statements emphasizing that Maggie was the primary victim of Tony's financial malfeasance, urging the press to respect her privacy. Charles Beaumont and David Boies coordinated relentlessly, building a concrete case against Tony, forging documents, changing locks in the dead of night, and attempting to funnel money illegally. Their goal was clear: secure a swift divorce decree and ensure Tony had no parental custody beyond supervised visits unless he could prove himself stable. This last part tore at Maggie's heart. As hurt and furious as she was at Tony, she still believed their child deserved a father. But Tony's volatile behavior made her fear for the baby's safety. A father prone to deceit, possibly linked to dangerous people, could she trust him around a newborn? Despite her reservations, Maggie pushed her attorneys to keep the door open for Tony to seek counseling or rehabilitation. She didn't want to sever that possibility completely. Meanwhile, the tabloids continued to swirl with rumors that Tony was planning a massive tell-all interview. Maggie dreaded the thought of personal details being aired for public consumption. She also worried about her father. Though James Kensington stood as a fortress of unwavering resolve, she feared the cumulative toll of these drawn-out battles on his health. In an effort to reclaim some normalcy, Maggie resumed her philanthropic endeavors. She spearheaded a fundraising event for a children's hospital, dedicating it to her unborn child. Despite her emotional turmoil, she found solace in helping others. In a world consumed by scandal, it was a reminder that generosity and hope could still flourish. As the months slipped by, Maggie's pregnancy neared its final stage. Each new day brought her closer to motherhood and closer to a reckoning with Tony. The combined legal teams had set a preliminary court date to address the divorce and property matters. But Tony's lawyers kept delaying, filing motion after motion. It was an exasperating strategy to wear her down, perhaps to push for a settlement. Maggie held firm. She told her father she refused to give Tony a penny more than what was legally required. Behind the tinted windows of her town car, on her way to her final ultrasound, Maggie gazed out at the bustling city. She felt the baby kick, a reassuring sign of life amid the turmoil. She whispered a vow to her unborn child: "I will protect you no matter what. Nobody will lock us out of our own life again." The day of the preliminary court hearing arrived, a crisp winter morning. The courthouse buzzed with reporters and photographers jostling for position as Maggie stepped out of a black SUV. Her father followed closely behind, flanked by attorneys. Across the wide marble steps, Tony emerged from a separate car, accompanied by Trevor Holcomb. The tension between them was tangible. Inside the courtroom was hushed except for the shuffling of legal documents. A judge known for her no-nonsense demeanor presided, Judge Marianne Delgado, a woman with a reputation for cutting through theatrics. As the proceedings began, Tony's team tried to paint him as a loving husband who made an honest mistake. Holcomb argued that the changes to the locks were done in the interest of home security, and the forging of signatures was a misunderstanding resulting from complicated real estate transactions. Charles Beaumont, stoic and prepared, systematically dismantled these claims. He presented evidence, bank statements, recorded phone calls, even emails in which Tony hinted at forging documents for financial gain. A hush fell over the courtroom when a forensic analyst took the stand, confirming that Maggie's signature on the refinancing papers was indeed forged. Tony's face, hardened jaw set in defiance. Maggie sat quietly, a calm poise belying her inner turmoil. She had her doctor's clearance to attend, though she was visibly far along in her pregnancy. Anxiety clenched her stomach, but she forced herself to breathe slowly to remain focused. Her father offered a reassuring squeeze of her hand as she testified. She spoke briefly about how she discovered the locks changed how unsafe she felt in her own home, how she had once adored Tony, but now feared him. Tony shot her a glance, an odd mixture of bitterness and regret. For a moment he opened his mouth as if to speak directly to her. Then, recollecting himself, he stared straight ahead. He seemed like a man grappling with the weight of consequences for the first time in his life. Judge Delgado took notes, her expression impassive. After hearing arguments from both sides, she declared that there was overwhelming evidence of fraud and intimidation. She temporarily granted Maggie sole possession of the mansion and froze Tony's ability to access any marital assets. She also upheld the restraining order. The judge scheduled another hearing in 2 weeks to finalize property and custody arrangements. As the gavel struck, Tony's hopes of a quick victory evaporated. He glared at Maggie and her father from across the aisle as though blaming them for his downfall. In truth, he blamed everyone but himself. Outside, reporters swarmed. Maggie, overwhelmed, clutched her father's arm as they pushed through the throng. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward with breathless questions. Mrs. Giordano, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you believe Tony acted out of malice? Will you allow him custody of the baby? Maggie answered only with silence. The words she wanted to say, how betrayed she felt, how frightened she'd been, were too raw, too personal. All she could do now was wait for the final hearing and the birth of her child, both on the horizon, both shaping the destiny of the Kensington legacy. Despite the court victory, Maggie found it hard to sleep at night. The mansion's halls felt haunted by memories of happier times. She roamed the corridors, gazing at the gallery of family portraits. One photo featured her grandparents dancing at a ball. Another showed her father as a young man shaking hands with a senator. All around were reminders of the Kensington history, a lineage built on ambition, brilliance, and, yes, secrets. Would her child look at pictures of Tony someday and ask, "What happened to Daddy?" The thought weighed heavily. James sensed his daughter's loneliness. He tried to be there for her, often spending evenings discussing baby names, pediatricians, nursery designs. Yet an undercurrent of guilt laced Maggie's interactions with her father. She knew he had orchestrated Tony's downfall, albeit righteously, and she was grateful. But part of her couldn't erase the question, should I have seen the signs earlier? Could I have stopped this catastrophe? Tony, for his part, appeared sporadically in gossip columns. He was photographed at upscale lounges with questionable company, fueling speculation that he was seeking new investors or forging alliances. Rumors swirled that he was compiling a dossier of dirt on the Kensington family to leverage a settlement. One particularly nasty rumor suggested Tony might try to contest the child's custody to gain financial leverage. This threat alone drove Maggie to near panic, imagining a future custody battle with a man who once forged her name to steal her home. Her doctors, noticing her escalating stress levels, encouraged her to take a break from the city. "Your blood pressure is inching up," one doctor warned. "Find a peaceful place to rest, away from the cameras and the tension." At James's insistence, Maggie retreated to a secluded family cabin upstate, an idyllic lakeside property guarded by thick pines and discreet security. She planned to remain there until after the baby was born. The serenity of the lake soothed her. She took gentle walks, inhaled the crisp mountain air, and felt the baby's movements as if they were a private conversation. Each flutter reassured her that no matter the chaos swirling in her life, her most important responsibility was right here, growing inside her. Meanwhile, Charles Beaumont and David Boys continued to fortify the legal walls around Maggie. They discovered more evidence of Tony's financial misdeeds, shell companies' questionable offshore accounts. They suspected he might be funneling funds out of the country in anticipation of a large judgment against him. The attorneys prepared a robust motion to ensure he couldn't siphon away marital assets or vanish before the next court date. Still late at night, Maggie couldn't quell the gnawing fear that Tony might do something drastic. She remembered his steely glare the day he was forced out. She recalled the old adage, "A wounded animal is the most dangerous." There was a sense that Tony would orchestrate one final attempt at revenge. Maggie just didn't know when or how. Until the next hearing, she was left with little choice but to wait, motherly instincts on high alert, preparing for all possible storms. The days leading up to Maggie's due date were supposed to be filled with calm. She should have been choosing nursery wallpaper, packing a hospital bag, and reading parenting books while curled up in a sunlit window. Instead, her world narrowed into a state of hypervigilance, waiting, watching, bracing for Tony's next move. Then the headlines hit. On a brisk Tuesday morning, the quiet cabin where Maggie had been recovering was broken by the persistent buzzing of her phone. She checked the screen only to find a cascade of messages from friends, reporters, even distant relatives. At first, she feared something had happened to the baby, but when she opened the news app, the story was front and center. Revealed Giordano's web of deceit, private emails hint at blackmail fraud. The article, published by one of the country's most respected investigative journalists, detailed a damning exposé. Tony's private emails had been leaked emails that painted a chilling picture. There were lines about forging Maggie's signature, manipulating real estate transfers, and worst of all, using the unborn child as leverage in settlement threats. One email read, "If I can't get what I deserve, I'll make sure the Kensingtons are dragged through the mud." It wasn't just gossip now, it was evidence. Maggie sat frozen on the cabin's leather sofa, her hand cradling her belly protectively. Elizabeth kicked gently as if reminding her to breathe. She felt rage, yes, but also something else, vindication. Finally, the world could see what she had tried so long to hide behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. James Kensington was already on the phone with her within minutes. "It's worse than we thought," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But this will help us in court. Boyce's team is preparing to file emergency motions." Tony, meanwhile, went into PR overdrive. Reporters caught glimpses of him entering his attorney's office and heard whispers that he was planning to issue a statement. Then, just when things couldn't get more surreal, it happened, a public letter. It was published through a celebrity gossip site that Tony had clearly chosen for maximum exposure. The letter was framed as an apology to Maggie. He wrote about the pressure he had felt, his fear of being cast aside, and how financial stress had clouded his judgment. He denied malicious intent, but admitted that mistakes were made and that he longed to be a father to his daughter. Maggie read the letter several times, and with every sentence her skepticism grew. It wasn't remorse, it was strategy. He wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was setting the stage for a custody claim. Her legal team agreed. "He's softening public perception," Charles Beaumont explained. "It's a calculated pivot from villain to victim, but it won't hold up in court." Days after the letter's publication, Maggie's world shifted again, this time from within. It began with a dull ache in her lower back, then waves of pressure that wouldn't go away. Her doctor, stationed nearby for this very reason, confirmed what Maggie already knew: labor had begun. She was rushed to the nearest hospital under the cover of night, escorted by private security to shield her from the press. Snow fell in soft sheets as the SUV made its way through winding upstate roads. In the delivery room, despite the whirlwind of monitors, nurses, and IVs, there was one moment that anchored Maggie like nothing else: the sound of her baby's cry. It was powerful, defiant, alive. Elizabeth Giordano entered the world healthy and strong, a full 2 weeks early. Maggie wept as she held her daughter for the first time. Not just from the rush of hormones and exhaustion, but because this child, so tiny, so unaware, had already survived so much. She was the reason Maggie had endured, the reason she hadn't folded under the pressure of betrayal and scandal. James arrived soon after, visibly shaken, but smiling through tears as he held his granddaughter. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You both are." Later, as dusk turned to night, Maggie sat quietly in her hospital bed, cradling Elizabeth against her chest. Her phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. She hesitated, then opened it. "Congratulations on the birth of Elizabeth. I am truly sorry, Tony." It was brief, unassuming, no demands, no threats, just a sentence that sat on the screen like a ghost. Maggie stared at it, unsure what to feel. Her first instinct was to delete it, but instead she powered off her phone entirely. Tonight there would be no more headlines, no more manipulation, no more fear. There was only her daughter and the quiet promise of starting again with strength, clarity, and a love untethered to any past mistakes. The day of the final court hearing arrived only 2 weeks after Elizabeth's birth. Maggie was still recovering, but she felt resolute, determined to close this chapter and focus on her daughter's future. She arrived at the courthouse cradling Elizabeth in her arms, accompanied by James, who gently carried the diaper bag. The baby slept peacefully, ignorant of the swirling tensions. Tony was already inside, looking pale and unnerved. He cast furtive glances at Elizabeth, the first time he'd seen his daughter in person. Maggie noticed his eyes soften in emotion that might have been genuine paternal longing, but the swirl of lawyers and documents and the memory of his betrayals overshadowed any moment for a heartfelt reunion. Judge Delgado took the bench, glancing sympathetically at the infant in Maggie's arms. The hearing began with the property and financial matters. Charles Beaumont laid out a meticulous case itemizing Tony's forged documents, fraudulent refinancing attempts, and defaulted loans. They requested that any community property be forfeited to Maggie as restitution for legal fees and emotional distress, citing Tony's wrongdoing as the basis. Tony's lawyer Holcomb attempted a meager defense, claiming Tony had fallen victim to unscrupulous business partners and acted under duress. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The judge listened patiently, then methodically agreed to dissolve the marriage. All property that could be traced back to Maggie's inheritance remained exclusively hers. Tony was left with virtually nothing but personal items. Next came the question of custody. With Maggie's permission, Tony had petitioned for supervised visitation rights, claiming he wanted to be a father to Elizabeth. The tension in the room was palpable. Tony's body language conveyed desperation. He looked at Maggie with pleading eyes. No matter their history, a part of Maggie sympathized. Elizabeth was, after all, also his child. Judge Delgado turned to Maggie. "Mrs. Giordano, do you wish to contest the supervised visitation request?" Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Everyone awaited her response, including Tony, who seemed on the verge of tears. She glanced down at Elizabeth's serene face. The baby yawned and stretched, unaware of the legal drama shaping her life. Maggie exhaled, mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. Tony's treachery versus Elizabeth's right to know her father. The risk of Tony manipulating the child versus the possibility that fatherhood might redeem him. "I don't wish to contest supervised visitation," Maggie finally said, her voice wavering. "I believe every child deserves a chance to know both parents, but I want stringent guidelines to ensure Elizabeth's safety." Tony closed his eyes in relief. Judge Delgado nodded, impressed by Maggie's measured approach. She set strict conditions. Tony would have monthly supervised visits at a child care facility, monitored by a court-appointed social worker. Any violation of these terms, any hint of harassment or manipulation, and his visitation rights could be revoked. A wave of chatter rippled through the courtroom. Tony attempted to mouth a thank you to Maggie, but she avoided eye contact, focusing on Elizabeth. The sound of the gavel signaled the conclusion. The divorce was granted. The property deed belonged entirely to Maggie, and Tony's role in Elizabeth's life was confined to a narrow corridor of supervised visits. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters awaited the final verdict. James shielded Maggie and Elizabeth from camera flashes, while Charles Beaumont provided a succinct statement. "We are pleased that justice has been served, and Maggie and her child's interests remain fully protected." Yet, in a surprising moment, Tony approached Maggie in the parking lot. Security guards tensed, but Tony held up his hands in a gesture of peace. Maggie nodded that it was okay. She wanted to hear what he had to say. He spoke softly, eyes darting to baby Elizabeth. "I've lost everything," he said, voice cracking. "I deserve it. But I want you to know I'm sorry. For the locks, the lies, the forgery. I was desperate. I thought I could build a future with you, but my mistakes caught up to me." His gaze lingered on Elizabeth. "Thank you for letting me see my daughter. I promise I'll do my best for her." Maggie's eyes brimmed with tears. She had fantasized about telling Tony off, about demanding an explanation for every transgression. But now, holding Elizabeth, the anger that once fueled her seemed distant. She nodded a silent acknowledgement, then turned and walked away. Tony stood there, hands shaking as a security guard politely but firmly ushered him back. In the days that followed, Maggie began rebuilding. She moved permanently into a different Kensington property, a tastefully modern estate with tight security and child-friendly spaces. She set up a nursery for Elizabeth replete with pastel colors and whimsical designs. The baby thrived, cooing and giggling at every new sensation, a daily reminder of fresh starts. Financially, Maggie remained safe within the fortress of the Kensington holdings. Emotionally, she invested in counseling sessions, determined to heal from the betrayal. She planned out a co-parenting plan that adhered to the court's guidelines, though she couldn't shake a lingering wariness about Tony. Time alone would tell if he would become a stable presence in Elizabeth's life, or fade into memory as the father who lost everything. James Kensington, after witnessing the tumult of the past months, proposed a toast one evening. Maggie joined him in his private study, Elizabeth asleep upstairs. He poured sparkling cider for her, whiskey for himself. To Elizabeth, James said, lifting his glass, "May she learn from our family's mistakes and grow up with a better world at her disposal." Maggie clinked her glass against his eyes, wet with gratitude. The storm that had nearly consumed her life was over, at least for now. She would forever be changed by the betrayal and the subsequent triumph. Yet, standing beside her father under the regal portraits of Kensington ancestors, she felt the stirrings of hope. Perhaps the greatest victory was not that Tony was locked out, or that the deed had changed hands. The true triumph lay in Maggie discovering her own strength, the resolve to fight for her child, to face betrayal head-on, and still keep the capacity to show compassion. She had learned that wealth could be both a shield and a target, and love could be both a salvation and a weapon. As Maggie headed upstairs to check on Elizabeth, she paused at the top landing, glancing at a portrait of her mother, who had passed away when Maggie was a teenager. In the portrait, her mother looked serene, wise. Maggie murmured a silent prayer. "Thank you wherever you are. We're going to be okay." She continued into the nursery where Elizabeth rested in a crib lined with soft blankets. Outside the window, the night sky stretched vast and twinkling, an open canvas of possibility. Maggie leaned down to kiss her daughter's forehead, promising silently that whatever hardships lay behind them, their future would be guided by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond they shared. A new dawn had risen on their lives, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt she could breathe freely. And so ends the tumultuous saga of changed locks, altered deeds, and shattered illusions. Maggie Kensington survived betrayal by discovering a boundless well of courage within herself, the courage to protect her child, to fight for justice, and to hold on to hope in the face of adversity. In the end, Tony lost the very thing he tried to steal, but gained a chance, however narrow, to be present in his daughter's life under strict conditions. The Kensington legacy endures, but more importantly, Maggie stands tall in her own right, a testament to resilience and grace. If you found this story of heartbreak and redemption compelling, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us continue to bring you stories that highlight life's rawest emotions and greatest triumphs. Thank you for watching, and remember, true strength is often forged in the midst of our hardest trials.